From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We start today with the markets, where the equity markets are at session lows right now, with the S&P 500 off about 2%, and the NASDAQ off just below 3%. So the markets are selling off, apparently, in response to those economic numbers we got this morning, that third GDP read. And to take us through those numbers and what they tell us about the economy, welcome now Nathan Sheets. He's Global Chief Economist for Citi. Nathan, great to have you with us. So these numbers were surprisingly strong. Normally, by the third read, I'm not paying too much attention to the GDP. This time I paid attention.
Well, I think these data pointed to ongoing strength in the consumer, and actually a little bit more strength than was previously thought during the third quarter. And I think it's coming in a context where we're seeing the consumer is remaining resilient. And particularly the demand for services is staying very strong. And I think the reality is that as a result of the pandemic, we had several years where we didn't spend on services. And there is enormous pent-up demand for services in the economy. And I think we see it in a lot of places. And that's the good news for growth. But that is also the key driver of inflation right now. And right at the center of the Fed's concerns is this services price inflation that's resulting.
Well, and I guess related to that, Nathan, we had consumer spending at 2.3%. It had been projected at 1.7%. And boy, business fixed income was up 6.7%. So there's still a lot of money being spent out there.
Yeah, the reality is that the corporates, a great point, that the corporates so far have weathered this storm very well. Earnings have stayed strong generally. And I think one of the questions we have as we look into 2023 is what happens to margins, what happens to earnings, and what are the implications of that for the equity market. But I think that strong business fixed investment number you cite is echoing this reality that, you know, corporates have also done quite well over the last year or so from an earnings perspective.
These numbers we got today come on the heels of numbers we got yesterday, which were really bad for the housing industry. But consumer confidence numbers, I understand those are squishy, but they're forward-looking, were really quite strong. Is the consumer proving more resilient and sustaining this economy more than perhaps the Fed might have anticipated?
The consumer has been extraordinarily resilient. As you say, housing, I think, is something of a separate story, that it's very interest rate sensitive. And that is a place where the Fed's rate hikes are getting traction. And housing has slowed maybe even more rapidly than I would have expected. But for the consumer more broadly, I think we're at a place where there's a tailwind from lower gas prices. And the reality is this tight labor market is continuing to generate wages and income for households and the new employment. And so folks have this pent-up demand for services. They're still employed. Wages are rising. Incomes, when you add income plus wages, it's about staying up with inflation. People still have money to spend.
So, Nathan, come back to housing just for one last point, and that is on the mortgage rates, because when the mortgage rates went up, I guess there's a lot of almost freezing in the market because people have more attractive mortgages. They don't want to trade in for a new mortgage for a new house. But is that being changed a bit right now? Because they peaked out, I think, over 7%. They're back down in the 6s now. Is that enough to free up the housing market, or does it have to get to a point where the Fed is actually starting to cut rates?
I think this moved down from over 7% in the mortgage rate to, 6.3, 6.4 kind of territory is on the margin likely to provide a little support for housing demand, but I don't think that's the game changer. I think that the mortgage market is likely to remain a challenge, and mortgage rates a challenge for households thinking about buying new homes until the Fed actually starts cutting, which we expect will be in 2024.
Nathan, if you take all this and put it together, what does it tell us about inflation? We've been hoping that inflation has peaked, it's going to start coming down. There have been some indications of that. At the same time, what do these sort of economic numbers tell us about how long it's going to take before it really makes substantial inroads in inflation?
When I put all of this together, I would describe the inflation story as concerning, but a little more nuanced than it was 3 or 4 months ago. And we are seeing some good news from goods price disinflation. In recent months, goods inflation has come down meaningfully, and we expect that to continue. Oil prices are off. That's helpful. Lower house prices take a while to pass through, up to a year, into the shelter index of the CPI, but that seems like it's happening. So some of the parts of the inflation process are coming off, but services inflation, which Jay Powell has emphasized, is more than half of core PCE. That's still running 6% plus kind of range, and that's too hot. And the Fed has got to stay tough until it sees wages and services inflation come down.
So that is the question. What does this all mean to the Fed? You just took us right there, because if you look at the markets today, we now have the 10-year yield back up at 3.6%. It's not astronomical. At the same time, it's come back from where it was. And particularly the dollar is strengthening today, I guess in anticipation of further rate hikes.
Yeah, putting all this together for the Federal Reserve, on the margin, we're probably seeing a little bit more resilience in the economy, pointing to a little bit more persistence in services inflation. And it just reinforces the Fed's resolve. They're at 4.25. We think they're going to go up into the mid fives by the middle of next year. There's still hiking to come. And in addition, and I don't think this point is sufficiently appreciated, monetary policy influences the economy with a lag. So not only do we have in the future year more rate hikes, we also have the lagged effects of what the Fed has done this year. So there is going to be a significant headwind from monetary policy that will hit the economy during the first half of next year.
Nathan, you spent a lot of your career not just on U.S. economy, but globally, both at the Treasury and at the Federal Reserve. Give us your take on where we are globally, because there's a lot of concern about, if not a global recession, at least recession in significant parts of the globe.
We're calling our global outlook rolling recessions. We think that Europe, the Euro area and the UK are going to be in recession during the first half of next year. Maybe things in the Euro area start to look a little bit better in the second half as they shake off some of the effects of the gas shock. But that's when we think the monetary policy is likely to push the US into recession during the second half. And then the other major region is China. We actually have a forecast where Chinese growth accelerates, but there's lots of stresses and challenges there at the moment, as China has abruptly abandoned its zero COVID policy. They're seeing health challenges and COVID infections rise sharply. Lots of challenges as to whether they're able to continue with this policy. And even if they do, whether consumers on the other side are going to be in a position where they feel comfortable racing out of their apartments to go spend and travel and engage in activities that are going to lift growth. So major question marks in China as well.
Yeah, you know China so well, and right now it looks like they are having problems, obviously, coming off of the zero COVID policy. It looks like that may affect their economy in itself, because even if they let people back out, people don't want to go out. But I think an important question is, how long is that moment for adjustment? I mean, if they get through this pretty quickly, even if a lot of people get infected, then they'll bounce back. But how long might it last that they actually really subdue the economy because people cannot fully participate?
This is ultimately a question that probably extends more into a kind of a public health arena. But what I can tell you, David, is that in our forecast, we see a contraction in the Chinese economy, a mild one, but a contraction in the Chinese economy during the first quarter. And then as we move into the spring, as the weather gets a little bit warmer, then the economy is able to get some traction. So what we're assuming is that it's a Q1 phenomenon where this transition really has its most severe implications for economic activity. And then on the other side of that, there's scope, if consumers are so inclined, there's scope for them to increase their spending and travel and so forth.
Nathan, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure having you with us. Happy holidays, by the way. That's Nathan Sheets of Citi. Coming up, we're going to talk to Republican Congressman French Hill about President Zelensky's speech to Congress last night and how it might affect the omnibus spending bill. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. As we approach the end of the year, Congress has been very much in the spotlight with that historic speech from President Zelensky of Ukraine last night before a joint meeting of Congress. At the same time, Congress is trying to keep the government funded with an omnibus spending bill. To take us through all of this, we turn now to Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas. Congressman, great to have you with us as always. As I understand it, you were one of those, part of that committee that escorted President Zelensky down the aisle. Just give us a moment about what that moment was like.
Well, David, it's good to be with you. Happy holidays. Yeah, it was really an electric event in the House chamber last night with President Zelensky's traveling all the way around the world to come to the United States. His first trip outside Ukraine to thank the American people, thank President Biden and the leadership in Congress for all of America's support with our partners in Europe and around the world in backing the Ukrainians' effort to eject Putin from their sovereign land.
So, as you say, the lead of the speech was to thank the American people for everything that has been done. At the same time, there's a fair amount of talk in President Zelensky's speech as well about what needs to happen next, with approval of what's been proposed and even further things coming up down the road. As you look at the omnibus spending package right now, is there a potential connection between the two? Do you think that President Zelensky moved any hearts or minds to get moving on the omnibus bill because it does include money for Ukraine?
Well, look, on a bipartisan basis in both the House and the Senate, there is strong support for America's continued involvement in backing the Ukrainians, as long as we're also asking all of our partners and allies to do that as well, those in Europe and those in Japan and around the world, to equally step up and provide financial resources. But I don't think President Zelensky's speech changed any votes in the House or Senate about the big picture, which is this omnibus spending bill is just an illustration of a broken budget system here. We're spending on discretionary 25% more than we were just 2 years ago. And if you add in mandatory spending, which is 2/3 of spending, we're spending $1.3 trillion more annualized than we were just 2 years ago. So House Republicans want to get the responsibility next year of trying to fine-tune, cut this spending, and go back to pre-pandemic spending priorities.
So take us into that Congress. You're going to have a narrow majority in the House of Representatives. What are the prospects really for making changes? First of all, you won't have a majority in the Senate, but you will have a narrow majority in the House. Can you make a real difference?
Well, I think we can stop the rate of spending increases, but we could also propose good legislation in the House and encourage senators to get on board with us, fine-tune it. We need more spending at the border, less spending at the IRS, for example. We could come up with a rescission list of spending in this omnibus spending deal that we, House Republicans, think is wasteful, not in the best interest of the American taxpayers to move the American agenda forward. So we'll be doing that. We'll try to do all the appropriations bills on time next year and encourage the Senate to take action quickly, or we just won't take up bills coming from the Schumer Senate in the House. We'll just try to use our leverage to get the best outcome that we can.
Congressman, you said that there's broad support, of course, for Ukraine. At the same time, you want to make sure other people are paying their fair share. We've heard that from other Republicans, particularly with respect to the European Union. Also, some concern about maybe auditing what has been spent already. Is it difficult on the one hand to say we really fully support you, but we also want to count all the pennies?
No, I don't think so. I think that's expected by our taxpayers, that our inspectors general at the Department of State and Department of Defense have an obligation to make sure that our taxpayer resources are are being used in the right way by the United Nations or by the Ukrainian government, obviously. I think people in Europe feel the exact same way. We just want to make sure that the Europeans are stepping up, providing cash in addition to supporting all the displaced Ukrainians that they have in their territory. And you know, David, I'm reflecting on Nick Brady and Jim Baker from the good old days of their raising funding to pay for the ejection of Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. We need to rally all freedom-loving countries to contribute financially to this effort, even if they can't contribute militarily.
Yeah, in fairness, as I heard President Zelensky last night, he was helping make that case. There's not just the U.S., it's not just Ukraine, it's the rest of the freedom-loving world,
right,
basically, needs to get behind that. I think he delivered that message pretty powerfully. So let's look forward to this new Congress and who exactly is going to be in charge of the Republicans. First of all, I believe in the past you've said you think it will be Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House. Do you still think that?
I do. I was with Kevin this morning in our whole House conference. We had an outstanding meeting about priorities for the next Congress. And I think our members will get there and support Kevin McCarthy. Look, he has the vision on the agenda. He has the vision to raise the money and recruit the candidates that have allowed us both in 2020 and 2022 to gain seats in the House. He deserves a shot to be our Speaker in the new Congress.
So the question I have is, what hostages to fortune may he have to get in order to do it? Because he needs every single last vote, pretty much, at least as I understand it, Congressman. And what sort of deals is he going to have to make that may limit his effectiveness as the Speaker?
You know, no telling, but that's a job he has. And look, he's listening to every member in our conference. All the incoming chairmen of all the committees support Kevin McCarthy becoming Speaker. Our great majority leader supports Kevin McCarthy becoming Speaker. We are working hard to listen to our members who still object to him becoming Speaker and seeing what it's going to take to get them to yes. That's ultimately up to Kevin. But look, he was nominated by 85% of House Republicans in a secret ballot in our conference meeting.
Fair enough. If he does get to be Speaker, as you predict he will, is he going to need some Democrats, at least most often, to get real affirmative legislation passed? Because you do have such a narrow majority there.
It's the same challenge that Speaker Pelosi had in this past conference. You've got to really work with your members and identify exactly where people are before you bring each major bill to the House floor. That's something that he's committed to do with our membership, is that we'll work together to design that legislation before it comes to the House floor. I think that will help him hold and have a much better shot at earning that 218 votes just from Republicans.
Well, also, I really wonder whether, as a practical matter, assuming he again gets to be Speaker, in order to get things done, is he going to have to move the caucus a little bit more, if you'll forgive the expression, in a moderate direction?
Well, look, there's a lot we can do, I think, as Republicans on our priorities of getting the economy moving, unleashing American energy, holding President Biden accountable for the failures at the border, and moving things that we think are in the best interest of the American people, like a bill that would make the Trump tax cuts permanent for our families. So there's a lot that we all agree on inside the House Republican Conference, and I think they're basic, strong, middle, center-right values that are supported by the bulk of the American people.
So that's helpful. I understand within the conference itself, you can make some progress, you believe, on the economy. Let me ask you finally, maybe the trickiest one, which is immigration. It's a real crisis right now on the southern border. You don't need me to say that. You know that full well. Can that get really addressed without some bipartisan approach?
Very tough to do it without a bipartisan approach. I think we need to narrow the scope. People are always talking about, let's have a comprehensive immigration reform. I think that's impossible in today's politics. But couldn't we agree that we should continue to finish the border security measures that President Trump persuaded the Congress to fund? That would be straightforward. Couldn't we persuade a majority of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to change the definition of credible fear in asylum seeking? Couldn't we agree to get our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support that we should enforce the existing immigration laws inside our country? So we're going to work on that. We're going to look for the ability to get people on both sides of the aisle to agree, but we've just got to take it one topic, one step at a time to try to find that agreement.
You want to lay any odds on getting something done, you think, in the new Congress on immigration?
Hey, I've got a terrible track record in the past 8 years of predicting Congress. You know, Boehner always used to say when he was Speaker, Congress moves very slowly until it doesn't. So we'll be working on it, hard at it every day.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being with us. And by the way, happy holidays to you. That's Republican Congressman.
Happy holidays to you.
Great to have you with us. That's Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas. Still to come, we're going to get the military perspective on what President Zelensky had to say last night from retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. As we said at the top of the hour, there's something of an equity sell-off going on right now in the market. Actually, they're down even from where we started the hour. To take us through it and why it's happening, welcome now Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, what is going on and why?
Well, it is a pretty solid sell-off. It's the S&P 500 at this point near session lows. At session lows down 2.3%. We have that NASDAQ 100 down more, down 3.4%. And then we have the SOX, the chip index, down even more, down 5.8%. We'll be taking a look at that in a moment. So a piece of it is certainly the stronger than expected eco data today. Claims came in a little bit better. The GDP revised for a third time to the upside, suggesting that the Fed is going to be in full-on hiking mode next year in a way that the markets haven't believed. Yet the dollar and yield's not up so much. If that was really the cause of the sell-off for stocks, I think that you would see it more at the cross asset, where we have a big sell-off. Micron and the SOX. That SOX down sharply, down 6%. Micron's quarter, it was messy. The outlook not great. They're laying off 10%. And this is a boom and bust cycle. Their net income hasn't been negative for a number of years. It goes with DRAM pricing. That's the type of memory that goes into servers. And then NAND pricing goes into phones. So I think that folks are afraid that this bust cycle is going right into 2023.
So, Abigail, I have to say, I guess it's the way markets work, basically, because for the longest time we were complaining we don't have enough chips.
Yeah.
We got way too much demand.
Yep.
And Micron comes out and says, you know, we don't have enough demand. We got too many chips.
Well,
so
it's
be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's a classic boom and bust. During the pandemic, that was all we heard, that there's not enough chips, there's not enough chips. And then, of course, as Bitcoin went higher, chips went higher with Bitcoin. And now we have the bust side of everything where there's not enough demand, it's oversupplied, and as a result, the pricing has come in. That could be a real concern for the economy going forward.
So let me put you on the spot here. I don't know if you know or not, volume. Because we're getting into the holiday period, I always get a little bit nervous about how much volume is, because sometimes you can have some pretty thin trading and get some big numbers.
Well, the last time I looked, and I'm pulling it up right now just to make sure, it was down a little bit. Actually, it's just flipped slightly higher. That happened yesterday, too. So it's up just a little bit more. So it suggests that these sellers are a little bit serious. Let's see what tomorrow brings.
It's not just thin trading.
Yeah, it's not. Well, it is actually thin trading only because it's been so thin what it's compared to.
Oh, I see.
But relative to this thin trading, it's more solid, yes.
There you go. Okay, thank you so much. That's a great report from Abigail Doolittle. Coming up, we're going to talk to retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett. He's going to give us a military perspective on the latest U.S. aid to Ukraine and what President Zelensky says it could accomplish. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, welcome now Mark Crumpton. He is here with the first word.
David, thank you. The Guggenheim Partners Chief Investment Officer, Scott Minerd, has died. Guggenheim said in a statement the Bond King died after a heart attack during his regular workout. The company has begun implementing its succession plan. Investments will continue to be led by co-presidents Dina DiLorenzo and David Rohn and by Anna Walsh. The Senate reached a deal to hold votes on a $1.7 trillion government spending package, paving the way for passage as early as today to avoid a Christmas Eve shutdown. The move to advance the $45 billion in Ukraine aid in a broader spending package, ours got sidetracked. Plans were delayed after Democrats rejected a proposal after Republican Senator Mike Lee set an amendment for extending pandemic-era asylum restrictions. A new analysis shows China is likely experiencing 1 million COVID infections and 5,000 virus deaths every day. That's according to Airfinity, a London-based research firm that focuses on predictive health analytics. COVID is making its way virtually unchecked through China. Hospitals are overwhelmed with patients, and crematoriums are being pushed well beyond their capacity. Bloomberg has learned China plans to cut quarantine requirements for overseas travelers in January. Under the new rules, the requirement to spend time in a quarantine hotel or isolation facility would be scrapped, and arrivals into the country instead subject to 3 days of monitoring. Overseas arrivals currently isolate for as many as 8 days. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, so many of us were watching as President Zelensky addressed that joint meeting of Congress last night, and he started off by thanking the American public for all that has been given and acknowledging how much has been given, but he also said we might not be done yet. This is what he said in part.
And your support is crucial, not just to stand in such fight, but to get to the turning point to win on the battlefield. We have artillery. Yes. Thank you. We have it. Is it enough? Honestly, not really.
Not really enough. To take us through exactly what perhaps they still need, we welcome now retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, who has served as an Assistant Secretary of State and as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. So, General, thank you so much for being here. Always great to have you here. Let's start exactly with President Zelensky. Not enough. What more is required from your perspective as a military person who has fought these battles?
Well, the first question is, how far is Zelensky going to go? Is he going to try to push the Russian troops out of Ukraine and out of Crimea? If that's the case, we've done very good in supplying what he needs to hold his line and do tactical counteroffensives. But a strategic counteroffensive to take back the Donbass, to take back Crimea, is going to need a significant amount of offensive capability, which to this point we haven't provided.
Do we have the capability, if we decided to provide it, to actually allow him to go on offense? Does he have the wherewithal to do that against the Russians?
We'd have to give him the capability. We'd have to give him the F-16s. We'd have to give him the main battle tanks. We'd have to give him more artillery. We will have to give him those items that up to this point our policy has said we will not give to Ukraine because that somehow will provoke Russia and Putin.
So you make an interesting point. Up to this point, we didn't want to do it. We had in the news conference with President Biden yesterday a female journalist from, I believe, from Ukraine say, you know, up to this point, you didn't want to give us Patriots. Yeah. Now you're giving us Patriots. So why don't you just go to where you're going to go rather than do it piecemeal? What's the answer to that? Because I'm not sure I heard the answer from President Biden.
And I don't think they have an answer, because it's very interesting. In the Wall Street Journal CEO conference 2 weeks ago, Secretary Blinken said, we will give them enough to go back to status quo ante, basically the Minsk line. But if they want to go beyond that, that's up to them. Wasn't really reported that well, wasn't really picked up. But if we're only going to provide them enough to get them back to where they were in February 22, we've probably given them enough. If we want to help Zelensky take back his country, militarily, he will need more.
Let's talk about the Patriot battery, because that is something we'd resisted. Now, President Biden said yesterday, we are going to supply that. We're going to train them up on how to use that battery. A question we all have, I think, is exactly how does that change the game? We talked actually last night during the coverage of President Zelensky's remarks to Admiral Kirby from the White House and asked him the question, and he actually referred to ballistic missiles. This is part of what he had to say.
We have seen reports that the Russians are actually looking at trying to maybe perhaps purchase ballistic missiles from Iran. Iran has a burgeoning and growing developing ballistic missile program. We haven't seen that deal consummated, but if it would, this Patriot battery would certainly be very effective against that.
So, Mark, this was new to me, at least. I had not heard about the ballistic missile issue. What are the Patriots good for? Are they good for ballistic missiles? Are they good against drones? What are they used for?
Yeah, I think you've got to think about this term we call integrated air defense. It's really 3 levels. At the lowest level, the Germans have done a pretty good job providing their, what you would know as an ACAC gun, that shoot at the low-flying drones, possibly the low-flying low-flying cruise missiles. Then you have a medium tier, which we're providing the NASAMS. That's where the Stingers fire, so on and so forth. But the highest tier, which has been the most problematic, is the upper tier that is being used by Putin and his people to basically conduct a bombing campaign of Kiev and elsewhere. And if you add on top of that the introduction of ballistic missiles coming from Iran, you've got to have something to protect us, because right now Putin is not fighting the Ukrainian military. He is fighting the Ukrainian people. That's what President Zelensky needs, is help to prevent those weapon systems that operate at the higher tier of the atmosphere to be knocked down. And really the best system in the world for that is Patriot.
Does that higher tier almost inherently hold within it the possibility of shooting down Russian aircraft in Russian airspace? Because that might be something that would be quite provocative.
Yeah, we've seen a situation where, in fact, anti-aircraft missile pieces fell into Russian territory. At this point, Putin is not going to make a decision just because some shrapnel from a missile has fallen into his territory. If he does, we've got a completely different situation.
Well, part of the response we've had from Russia to President Zelensky's visit has been as I understand it, the defense ministry over there saying, okay, fine, send the Patriots in, we'll target them. What do we do to protect that battery when we provide it?
Yeah, I would suspect that those batteries will be protected better than the White House. I would expect them to have a ring of anti-aircraft capability around them to protect them from high-flying threats. And you can expect that there are going to be a significant amount of personnel, soldiers protecting those areas as well. They'll be protected more than the nuclear plant at Zaporizhia.
That's interesting. So, General, give us a broader sense of the battlefield right now as we go into the winter. You've already laid out the difference between holding the line as opposed to really going on the offense. Both sides appear to be pretty depleted right now, probably in terms of men as well as in terms of ammunition and other material. How long does it take for those two sides to resupply themselves, to get ready for further conflict? And does one side have an advantage over the other?
Yeah, well, let me plug an article I wrote for Wall Street Journal about a month ago on this very issue. In my belief, the best thing for the West and for Ukraine to do right now is dig in and start resupplying, retraining, refitting to get ready for offensives in the spring time period. But at the same time, continue to use the HIMARS and the long-range artillery to interdict the Russians attempting to do the same thing. Go after their ammunition dumps, go after their supply convoys, go after their food and fuel, so that by the time the spring comes around, which is the best time to do large-scale offensives, the Ukrainians are refitted and ready to go, and the Russians have not had a chance to do the same thing. So that will give the Ukrainians a significant advantage.
Last question. You heard actually in what President Zelensky said there. He talked about a turning point, that next year will be a turning point. Is he right? Is that plausible? And if that's right, what does that mean, a turning point?
Well, I think what a turning point means for President Zelensky is that he not only has retaken the lines from February 22, but he's gone deeper into the 4 provinces and possibly into Crimea as well. I don't think he wants to stop there, regardless of what the world wants to allow him to do. He certainly wants to liberate his entire country, and we're going to find out next year if we've given them enough capability, and he has been able to keep his people together to do that.
But as you explained, that's a major step for us.
Huge.
Yeah,
Yep.
It's a great explanation. Thank you so much. Very helpful. That is retired General Mark Kimmett. Coming up, we're going to get the view on retail sales as we head into the last hours of holiday shopping from Stacy Widlitz of SW Retail Advisors. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's that magical time of the year, and of course I mean retail shopping for the holidays. To bring us up to speed on how the retail is going this year, welcome Stacy Widlitz. She's founder and president of SW Retail Advisors. So Stacy, welcome back. Great to have you here. Do we have a sense of how it is going?
We do. And, I think, first of all, when you go into the mall right now, it's packed, right? But you can't buy anything because there's nobody to sell it to you. So even in stores that are not that busy, the lines to check out are excruciating. And what you're hearing from people is they're throwing down stuff and saying, I'm going home to buy this online. So it's unfortunate that the traffic is there, but the challenge is getting labor and getting people in and out of the stores. But generally, you saw the retail sales last week. They were not so great. We're hearing a lot of pressure on the big ticket side, the middle income customer. We're certainly seeing some of the heaviest promotions that we've seen since 2019. And that's the story as everybody's trying to clear inventory at the last minute.
So, okay, first of all, where are we on inventory? Because there was a supply chain problem. People stocked up a lot. Inventory's built up. Are they drawing them down?
Yeah, so that's what we saw. There was no inventory last year, right? Because we had this supply chain crunch. So all the retailers went out and bought stuff early because they were so concerned about not having anything. Then the stuff showed up too early and demand came way down. So we have this huge glut of inventory going into holiday. So now the retailers are blowing it out. We haven't seen promotions really since 2019. Now we're seeing 2019-like promotions. The good news is we're starting to clear. It's been painful, but you look at basically the difference between revenue growth and inventory growth. Now that gap is starting to shrink. We saw that with Nike, they reported the other day. So that's the good news, because that means on the horizon, we can eventually return to full price selling once we right size what's out there in stores and online.
Stacey, for purposes of the overall amount of retail sales, does it matter whether it's online or bricks and mortars? Because we saw obviously a dramatic increase during the pandemic in online. I've seen statistics that suggest that's come down some, but not nearly where it was before. But does it matter if the question is just how much you sell?
It really doesn't. It used to, because it was such a small part of the business that there was really, it was more expensive for retailers to operate. But now they're a lot more sophisticated. There's buy up in line, pick up in store. So the sales now, there's really no division. It's a very blurred line. The customer is shopping, they're buying it and picking up, or returning it online and buying it in store. So it really doesn't matter as long as they're making the sales. I think some of the things that we're seeing to get people into stores, we're seeing sometimes that there's better promotion in stores to kind of drive you in, to drive those impulse purchase buys right now.
Tell me about chains, because it's certainly a story here in New York City right now that a lot of the chain stores have been cut back. In fact, for our television audience, we'll put up a chart here that shows just how dramatic it is. But for retail, I can tell you it's showing a real cutback in a lot of the chain stores in New York. Is that just a New York phenomenon, or are we seeing some version of that across the country?
No, that's absolutely a nationwide issue. And we've really been going through and right-sizing the store base. And we were kind of getting close to where we needed to be before COVID. But then, as you say, online sales accelerated for apparel. It's going to be close to half the business now. Some of the furniture guys like Williams-Sonoma, 70% of their business online. So, we're seeing less need for stores. And then still we have chains like Bed Bath & Beyond that we really question, do we actually need that kind of store base, or should it be maybe half the size or less? So there's still more to go here.
Stacey, one last one here. I think we've been talking about gross. What about net? And by that, I mean, what about margins, given what's going on with inflation? Do we have any sense about how retailers are doing on the net rather than the gross?
Yes. So gross margins have been the focus, as certainly the cost of business is much higher right now because we're paying people more to get them to work. As we were just talking about, there's such a shortage of labor in stores. You're still seeing that. And of course, now as we have this supply chain glut, the inventory glut, we're trying to work through that. So the promotions are, again, the best we've seen in years. That's obviously a huge negative for gross margins. So we're seeing some of the lowest gross margins in years. But I think at this point, investors are looking forward to first half of the year and saying, once we clear, who are the brands that you want to own, who makes it through this, and whose brand really doesn't get hurt because of this promotional period. And I think, the most obvious one right there is Nike. They're working through it. Inventories are still too high, up 40%, but not as bad as last quarter. Getting better. China's starting to open. So I think there are brands out there that you need to take advantage right now, because on the other side of this, you're going to see more full price selling.
Stacey, thank you so much. By the way, I hope you've got all your shopping done. I bet you have. I bet you're terribly efficient.
Absolutely not.
Well, happy holidays to you. That's Stacey Widlitz.
You too.
She's president of SW Retail Advisors. Coming up, we're going to check in on how Congress is coming on that $1.7 trillion, yes, $1.7 trillion spending package, with people eager to get out of town for the holidays. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. With a lot of us, I suspect, are trying to get out of town before that storm hits the country, and that includes a lot of members of Congress, but they are right now up on Capitol Hill trying to pass a $1.7 trillion omnibus spending package. To take us through where they are and their likelihood of getting out of town, welcome now Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. He's host of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. So bring us up to speed. I know they've been working on this all the time. We've been on the air here. Have they made some progress?
Actually, they have some progress here. Here's the headline for you, David, because we can go deep in the weeds on this. It's pretty wonky stuff, much of it procedural. The headline is things are moving quickly now in the Senate as we speak, and it looks like it is going to be a very late night in the House. This had to come down to timing, of course, as we're creeping up on the holiday and this winter storm that will affect a lot of lawmakers' plans in getting home here. And there's, of course, a funding deadline that we should keep our eyes on for tomorrow night as well. This all had to do with a timing deal that Chuck Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, did strike, and he announced that this morning. That paves the way for about 15, roughly, amendments to get action on the floor, and one of them was holding this deal up, Senator Mike Lee's amendment that would extend Title 42 restrictions on the southern border. It failed. And so now we're seeing a very quick process, in many cases voice votes, when it comes to ticking through these amendments because they know how little time they have. Assuming this passes the Senate today, David, it looks like it will. It then goes to the House, which again could work all night on this. Nancy Pelosi, in her final news conference as speaker today, told reporters, as far as your airplanes are concerned, you're going to be on a plane tomorrow. It'll likely be in the morning as opposed to at night. But we're playing with fire here a little bit in this deadline, David, so they're going to likely pass a continuing resolution in the Senate just for cover, because it takes some time to enroll and get that bill to the president just so they don't miss that midnight deadline tomorrow.
Okay, that is a great explanation. Let me take you back just a half step if I could, and I won't hold you to this.
Yeah.
I'm just asking your best judgment. Part of the question,
Sure.
as I understand with Senator Lee's amendment, is if they had actually passed that, it was something that maybe the House couldn't live with, so they couldn't get it done.
Right.
Do you think that they're getting to something that'll get out of the Senate that you think the House could live with, so they're not going to actually be debating what's in the bill? It's just a question of enrolling it.
That does seem to be the case, actually, David. That was the big sticking point. And by the way, it was a sticking point in the Senate as well. Mitch McConnell was a little worried about this, having been trumping this deal he struck on defense spending. If this omnibus did not pass because the House rejected Title 42, Mitch McConnell can take credit for very little in this case because it would have simply been a continuing resolution that kept defense spending where it was. The increase that he got here was seen as a Republican win. So he was, if you could look at it that way, at odds with Mike Lee on this. He didn't want to see this fail. He wants it to go to the House, have the president sign it, and have a good feeling over Christmas dinner. That appears to be now in the works for Mitch McConnell and his colleagues.
So, Joe, let me ask you an unfair question. How long does it take to enroll this thing? I suppose it depends in part on how long it is, and I suspect it's thousands of pages as a practical matter. I mean, I think of enrolling as just making the formal version of it written up, but that can take some time.
That's right, 4,155 pages. It's sick that I know that. But yeah, look, it takes a couple of hours as well for it to transmit from the Senate to the House. They will get together and go through not each word, but as Nancy Pelosi explained this morning, each component of the bill. That's another, 2 to 3 hours. Then it goes to the House, and they could find themselves debating various amendments as well. So we'll find ourselves in the early morning tomorrow, I suspect, with headlines on the terminal.
So finally, Joe, if they do this two-track thing, they both do a continuing resolution and proceed on this one. Let's assume they don't get it enrolled in time. Is that just a matter of going over to the new Congress and it's just a formality at that point to get it enrolled, or could it actually open it back up again?
Well, no, it would likely just be, gosh, that's a really good question. You like to think they would pick up where they left off on this. I mean, when this new Congress begins, they have to find a speaker first. That could take days, and we're not going to be dealing with a government shutdown for that long. Look, this is something that everyone, despite what they might be saying publicly, wants to see passed, and that's the one thing we need to keep in mind.
And most of us just want to be able to go on to Christmas, to our holidays, without worrying about this anymore.
That's the idea.
Okay, Joe Matthew, our Washington correspondent. Listen to him this afternoon, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Sound On Bloomberg Radio. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power will continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we will go to Kyiv and talk with Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council about the Ukrainian reaction to President Zelensky's speech. And this is Bloomberg.